Imagine the most important British Prime Minister of the 20th century walking into a room, and nobody turning their head. No applause, no whispers, nothing. Just a small, neat man with a thin mustache, a quiet voice, and a habit of standing at the edge of every group photograph, while the world's gaze locks on the big figure beside him. Winston Churchill. Yet it would be this unnoticed man, Clement Attlee, who would one day defeat Churchill at the ballot box, rip up the old order of Britain, and build a welfare state from the ruins of war. And the strangest part? Nothing in his childhood suggested any of that was even remotely possible. The clock that would one day count down to a showdown with Churchill was already ticking. But in the beginning, all it seemed to be counting down to was a perfectly ordinary, comfortable, unremarkable life. Clement Richard Attlee was born on the 3rd January 1883 in Putney, then a respectable suburb of southwest London. Imagine red brick villas, laurel hedges, a comfortable Victorian home with polished furniture and servants who moved quietly in the background. His father, Henry Attlee, was a successful solicitor, solid, respectable, exactly the sort of man who believed in the empire, the church, and the rules. His mother, Ellen, was warm but strict, convinced that life was about duty, not drama. This was not the raw, hungry East End of London. This was the safe cocoon of the middle class. No one in that neat house looked at the timid, ginger-haired boy with the solemn eyes and thought, future revolutionary, future destroyer of privilege. They thought, future lawyer, perhaps a judge, maybe, if we're lucky, something in the city. There were 8 Attlee children in all, and young Clement was neither the loudest nor the brightest in the obvious way. He loved cricket. He loved order. He loved rules. At school, he wasn't the flashy star. He was the one who turned up on time, did what he was told, and quietly got the job done. Later, when journalists tried to peel back the layers of his personality, they were baffled. Where was the origin story? The moment of trauma? The poverty? The struggle? The rage that pushed him towards socialism? With Attlee, there was none of that. Instead, there was something far more unsettling. A man who calmly walked away from privilege not because he had to, but because he decided to. The first step away from that safe, predictable path began at Haileybury College, a public school with a proud imperial tradition. Its walls were lined with memorials to colonial administrators and officers who had died for the empire. Boys were trained to rule, to lead, to take charge of foreign lands in the name of Britain. Clement absorbed all of it. The discipline, the sense of service, the idea that Britain had a mission in the world. He played cricket on immaculate pitches, marched in cadet parades, and seemed entirely at ease in this world built to produce the rulers of tomorrow. His future appeared to be already written. From Haileybury, he went to University College, Oxford, to study history. Again, nothing about him screamed radical. He didn't throw himself into rowdy student politics. He didn't become a fiery speaker at packed debates. He joined the Liberal Club. He read what a polite, curious young man was supposed to read. He went to lectures. He played sport. He passed exams. If you had walked past him in a quad at Oxford, head slightly down, hands behind his back, you would never have picked him as the man who would one day nationalize the Bank of England and break Churchill's heart on election night. But history was already moving around him. The empire that Haileybury worshipped was changing. Factories in Britain's cities were swallowing up men, women, and children for long hours and low pay. Tenement slums were growing like a dark shadow beside the glowing streets of the wealthy. Social reformers were beginning to speak louder. The quiet guilt of the middle classes was turning into anger. For Attlee, the turning point didn't come in a library, or on a battlefield, or in some great public clash. It came in something that sounded, on paper, very modest. A boys' club. After Oxford, he qualified as a barrister, exactly what his parents had hoped. He joined his father's firm, put on the stiff collar, walked into court, and discovered a truth that quietly shocked him. He didn't care. He wasn't bad at it. He simply felt nothing. The law, as a career, left him cold. Then came the invitation that would change everything, to help run a club for poor boys in the East End of London. The Haileybury Club in Limehouse, linked to his old school, needed men of good character to guide working-class youth. It sounded noble, respectable, a worthy hobby for a gentleman. So he went. And the moment he stepped out of the railway station into the East End streets, the world he thought he knew began to fracture. The smell hit him first. Coal smoke, sweat, stale beer, rotting refuse. Children barefoot in the gutter. Women with hollow eyes standing in doorways. Men with shoulders warped by work, waiting for a job that might not come. Houses crushed together, one damp room after another. Walls flaking, windows cracked. This was not the Britain he had grown up in. This was another country, hidden inside his own city. Day after day, evening after evening, he worked at the club. Teaching, organizing games, trying to keep boys away from crime and drink and gangs. And every night he went back to his respectable home and felt the same thing growing inside him. Embarrassment. Then anger. Then something calmer and more dangerous. Conviction. He began to ask questions that made people around him uncomfortable. Why did some children grow up in light and space and others in filth? Why did a man's entire future depend on the accident of where he was born? Why did charity feel like a bandage over a wound that someone else kept reopening? Attlee started reading different books. He drifted towards the Fabian Society, with its belief in gradual democratic socialism. He attended lectures at Toynbee Hall, the famous settlement house where middle-class reformers lived among the poor to understand their lives. The law, with its polished procedures and stiff ritual, receded. The East End became his reality. And one day, quietly, almost without fuss, he chose sides. In 1908, Clement Attlee joined the Independent Labour Party. For a son of a conservative, well-off solicitor, this was a quiet act of rebellion as shocking as any smashed window or shouted slogan. He didn't announce it with fanfare. He simply shifted his entire life towards it. He moved to live in the East End. He gave up the secure path of a barrister for social work and local activism. He began to speak, shyly at first, at labor meetings. It would have been easy to dismiss him. He didn't thunder from the stage like a demagogue. He didn't charm a room. He spoke plainly, almost dryly. But he knew every alleyway, every cramped room, every empty stomach in Limehouse. When he said, "This must change," people believed him because they'd seen him at their bedside, not just on a platform. Still, to the wider world, he remained invisible. In the great drama of Edwardian politics, with Lloyd George thundering about people's budgets and conservatives warning of class war, Clement Attlee was a footnote, a minor character on a very minor stage. Then, in 1914, the world exploded. When the First World War broke out, Attlee was 31. He did what millions of other men did. He put on a uniform. But even here, the contrasts in his life collided. The carefully trained imperial officer from Haileybury, the socialist who believed in justice for working people, the son of privilege who had chosen to live among the poorest. He joined up first as a volunteer, then as an officer in the South Lancashire Regiment. And soon he found himself landing on a narrow strip of Turkish coastline that would become synonymous with mud, blood, and futility. Gallipoli. Picture him there. Not as the neat, bespectacled prime minister of later years, but as a young captain scrambling up a hostile hillside under fire. Shells tearing into the cliffs, bodies sliding back down the muddy slopes. Heat, thirst, confusion. British, Australian, New Zealand, and Indian soldiers thrown against steep, fortified ground in a campaign that was disastrously planned and brutally executed. In one of the assaults at Suvla Bay, Attlee was badly wounded. A piece of shrapnel tore into him, and he was evacuated, close to death. The man who would one day shape the future of Britain came within inches of having that future wiped out in a trench on a faraway shore. He recovered slowly, then was sent to fight again. This time in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. More heat, more sand, more men dying far from home in a war that seemed to devour entire generations. He saw the British Empire not as it was painted at Haileybury, all grandeur and marble, but as sweat, disease, and muddled orders from distant commanders. Yet the war didn't turn him into a pacifist. It did something subtler and much deeper. It hardened his belief that if men could be ordered to die for their country, then their country owed them something more when they came home than unemployment and a return to the slums. When Attlee was finally demobilized in 1919, he walked back into a Britain that was both triumphant and broken. Victorious banners fluttered in the streets. But so did anger. Factories were closing, prices were rising, disabled veterans begged on corners. The old political parties seemed tired, unsure how to deal with a country that had seen the inside of hell. He went back to the East End, back to Stepney, Limehouse, the place that had first opened his eyes. But now he was different. He had led men into battle. He had watched them die. The shy young social worker had become something harder, more decisive. A leader who did not care about the sound of his own voice, only about the effect of his actions. Local labor activists noticed. They pushed him forward, first as a councillor, then as an alderman. Then, in 1919, as mayor of Stepney. Imagine the scene. This small, unpretentious man who still traveled by tram and preferred a quiet pipe to smoky backroom intrigue. While being given the chain of office in one of the poorest boroughs of London, his mayor's palace was a district of overcrowded tenements, derelict docks, and hungry children. He set about governing not with grand gestures, but with a relentless focus on the basics: housing, health, welfare, education. In committee meetings, he was calm, almost boring, until someone tried to block a reform that would help the poorest. Then the quiet tone hardened. The man who hated drama in public could be pitiless in private when someone stood between him and what he knew needed to be done. The clock was ticking again, not just for him, but for labor itself. Could the party of workers and trade unionists break into national politics? Or would it be crushed between the old powers of liberal and conservative Britain? In 1922, Stepney Labour members put his name forward as parliamentary candidate for Limehouse. The seat was tough, but winnable. Attlee campaigned in the only way he knew how: tirelessly, locally, without theatrical flourishes. He knocked on doors where families knew him not as the candidate, but as the man who'd help them get a council house, or a doctor, or a place in school. When the ballots were counted, the quiet man from Putney, who had walked away from comfort to live among the poor, was elected member of Parliament for Limehouse. He walked into the House of Commons in his plain suit, looked up at the green benches, and saw the country's ruling class all around him: old-school ties, booming voices, magnificent self-confidence. And somewhere in that chamber, a man whose path would one day collide with his in a way neither could yet imagine. Winston Churchill, then a political nomad, restless, eloquent, hungry for glory. Churchill filled the room. Attlee, sitting far away on the labor benches, barely disturbed the air. But history had just placed them in the same arena, under the same clock. Within 2 years, Labour would form its first government under Ramsay MacDonald. Attlee, still an obscure figure to the public, would be pulled into office as Under-Secretary of State for War. The boy from Haileybury, who had seen the Empire's wars from the mud, was now helping to administer the army in peacetime. He was inside the machine of state at last. But the real test, and the beginning of the long, slow, bitter rivalry that would define his career, still lay ahead. The countdown to his clash with Churchill and to Britain's own moment of decision had only just begun. Picture this. The man who will one day sit in 10 Downing Street is standing in the House of Commons. And almost no one remembers he spoke. Speeches crash around him like waves, Churchill roaring from one bench, David Lloyd George needling from another, while Clement Attlee rises, clears his throat, and the scribbling in the press gallery slows, then stops. Reporters look down, listen for a moment, realize there will be no drama, no jokes, no verbal fireworks, only a dry, precise voice, talking about housing, unemployment, army estimates, and their pens move on to something more interesting. But politics, especially in the Britain of the 1920s and 1930s, had a cruel habit of mistaking noise for power. And while the loud men dazzled, the quiet man was learning how the machine really worked, waiting for the moment when the country would have no choice but to turn to him. When Labour formed its first government in January 1924, it was a political earthquake. For the first time, a party born from trade unions and working-class votes, not aristocrats and industrialists, held office. The establishment muttered about Bolshevism. The press warned of revolution. And among the new junior ministers packing their bags for Westminster offices was Clement Attlee, now Under-Secretary of State for War. He walked into the War Office with memories no textbook could teach. Gallipoli mud, Mesopotamian heat, the faces of men waiting for orders that might kill them. Now he sat at a desk under portraits of generals and helped administer the very institution that had almost taken his life. He pushed for better conditions for soldiers, more fairness and promotion, less of the old-class snobbery that treated working class men as cannon fodder and public school boys as natural officers. These weren't heroic front-page reforms, but to the men in uniform, they mattered. The government itself, though, was fragile. Labour had no majority. It depended on liberal votes. After just 9 months, a scandal over a supposedly seditious letter from a Soviet official, probably a forgery, gave its enemies the excuse they needed. Ramsay MacDonald's government fell. In the election that followed, the Conservatives swept back to power. For Attlee, It was a first taste of something that would haunt his entire career. You can change people's lives from office, but you can't hold office unless you win, and keep winning. A brutal, unforgiving numbers games. He kept his Limehouse seat in 1924. He went back into opposition. He sat on committees. He watched. He waited. Then, in 1929, the pendulum swung again. Labor won the largest number of seats. MacDonald formed his second government, and this time Attlee was given a place in the cabinet itself. Postmaster General. It sounded dull. It wasn't. He was being tested in exactly the way that suited him best. Not on the platform, but at the desk. Not in soaring rhetoric, but in the grind of administration. And then the world's economy collapsed. The Wall Street crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across the Atlantic. British exports shrank. Unemployment soared. Lines lengthened outside labor exchanges. Men tramped the country looking for work that didn't exist. Angry marches passed beneath Attlee's London windows. Banners demanding bread, jobs, hope. Inside government, a storm was gathering. Numbers on treasury papers that spelled disaster. The pound under pressure. Fears of bankruptcy. International bankers demanding cuts. Ramsay MacDonald, once the hero of labor, stood at the center of it all, paralyzed between loyalty to his movement and fear of economic meltdown. The solution proposed by civil servants and financial experts was brutal. Slash spending, cut unemployment benefits, make the poorest pay for the crisis. Many in labor said, never. Attlee was one of them. To throw the burden of a global crash onto the shoulders of those already struggling felt like a betrayal of everything they'd gone into politics to do. In August 1931, the impossible happened. Instead of standing with his party and resigning, MacDonald chose another path. He walked out, taking a handful of ministers with him, and formed a national government with the Conservatives and Liberals to carry through the cuts. For Labour, it was a shattering moment. The leader who had taken their movement into office had, in their eyes, crossed the floor to stand with their class enemies. Posters went up calling MacDonald a traitor. Old comrades spat his name. Attlee stayed. He refused to follow MacDonald into the national government. He remained with the battered, bewildered Labour Party as it was pummeled in the October 1931 election, reduced to a tiny, humiliated group of just 52 MPs. Many of Labour's biggest names were wiped out. Attlee survived. In that shrunken parliamentary party, someone had to take responsibility. Arthur Henderson became leader, but he lost his seat soon after. In the chaos, the quiet man from Limehouse, still not a famous figure even within his own party, found himself acting leader of the opposition for a time. It was as if the stage lights had accidentally tilted and settled on the one actor who hadn't come to play the hero. He didn't change his style. No sudden roaring speeches. No theatrical gestures. He still arrived in the Commons using public transport, still went home each night to a modest house, still wrote careful notes in a neat hand rather than hurling insults across the chamber. And yet, in the private corridors, something was changing. Other Labour MPs began to notice that this apparently colorless man never panicked, never exploded, never lost track of what mattered. When he said he would do something, it got done. In 1935, after another election defeat and Henderson's resignation, the party needed a new leader. The favorites were two big, noisy beasts: Herbert Morrison, sharp, ambitious, Mayor of London, and Arthur Greenwood, a powerful platform speaker. Clement Attlee was the compromise candidate, the man in the middle, the one you put on the ballot because you had to fill the list. And then the votes were counted. Morrison split the anti-Greenwood vote. Attlee slipped through the gap. By a mixture of accident, exhaustion, and quiet respect, he became leader of the Labour Party. The reaction in the press was withering. A little man. A stopgap. Even some colleagues saw him as a caretaker. No one imagined that the real confrontation of his life, his rivalry with Winston Churchill, the drama that would decide the fate of Britain, was now moving from the edges of the stage to the center. The mid-1930s were darkening. Adolf Hitler ruled Germany. Fascism was on the march in Europe. Japan was expanding in Asia. The League of Nations, set up after the First World War to keep peace, looked weaker every month. The British government, now led by conservative Stanley Baldwin and then Neville Chamberlain, clung to a policy that would become infamous: appeasement. Give Hitler what he wants in the hope that it will satisfy him. Avoid war at almost any cost. On the right of British politics, there was one noisy dissenter: Winston Churchill. thundering against appeasement, warning about German rearmament, demanding Britain build up its defenses. He was seen by many as a dangerous maverick, a man stuck in the past, obsessed with war and glory. On the left, there was Clement Attlee, calmer, more cautious, but increasingly convinced that fascism could not be bought off. He had seen what poverty and despair could do to a country. He had no illusions about the promises of strongmen. Churchill and Attlee were not allies. They distrusted each other. Churchill thought Labour was soft on defense. Attlee saw Churchill as an imperial adventurer, a man who had backed interventions against workers and colonial peoples. But history was about to trap them in the same burning building. In September 1938, Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich and came back waving a piece of paper, declaring peace for our time after handing Hitler a chunk of Czechoslovakia. Crowds cheered him. Many wanted desperately to believe it was true. Attlee did not cheer. He listened to Chamberlain's report in the Commons, then rose and spoke, again, in that flat, precise voice, against the agreement. Britain, he said, had chosen dishonor in the hope of avoiding war. It would get both. A year later, Hitler invaded Poland. Britain declared war. The countdown that had begun in Attlee's quiet youth, with his first steps into the East End, now accelerated with terrifying speed. The phony war ended in 1940 with catastrophe. German forces smashed through Norway, Belgium, Holland, France. British troops were hurled back to the sea at Dunkirk. The government of Neville Chamberlain, discredited and distrusted, began to crumble. In May 1940, the crisis came to a head in the House of Commons. Chamberlain's majority melted. Even his own backbenchers turned on him. The question was not just who would lead the Conservative Party, but who would lead Britain herself. At the very moment when invasion seemed a real possibility, there were two contenders. Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, aristocratic, cautious, associated with appeasement, and Winston Churchill, the bulldog, blamed by some for past disasters, but now, the one man many felt could rally the nation. Here, the quiet man suddenly held extraordinary power. Churchill could not form a national government alone. He needed Labour to join him, to show that the whole country was united in the face of Hitler. And Labour, in turn, had a leader whose modest appearance concealed a spine of steel. Attlee and his colleagues met in a small room in the Commons, the air thick with cigarette smoke, the sound of bombs, in a few weeks' time, soon to become a nightly soundtrack over London. They debated. Would they serve under Chamberlain? Could they trust Churchill? Attlee was clear. Labour would not join any government led by Neville Chamberlain. The man of Munich, the man who had presided over rearmament failures and disaster in Norway, had to go. Time was running out. The king wanted an answer. Hitler's armies were on the move. Every hour of delay weakened Britain's already fragile position. In these tense, almost unbelievable days, Clement Attlee effectively decided who would lead Britain. By making Labour's participation conditional, he closed the door on a Chamberlain-led coalition and quietly pushed the country toward Churchill. On 10 May 1940, as German tanks rolled into Belgium and the Netherlands, Churchill became prime minister. Shortly afterwards, he asked Attlee to bring Labour into a wartime coalition. Attlee agreed, but not as a supplicant. He came in as deputy leader of the House, then as Lord Privy Seal, and from 1942, effectively as deputy prime minister. The rivalry that had simmered across the chamber now moved into the same cramped offices, the same underground war rooms. Churchill was the voice of defiance. Radio speeches, V-signs, cigars, bulldog jowls, phrases that seared themselves into history. Attlee was something else entirely. The man in the next room, chairing committees, making sure that factories got their steel, that bombed-out families got rehoused, that food was rationed fairly, that the enormous, clumsy war machine actually functioned. While Churchill flew to Washington, to Moscow, to Cairo, Attlee often ran the country in his absence, calling meetings, signing papers, steering domestic policy. The public didn't see this. They saw the lion, not the mouse. But inside Whitehall, officials noticed that when Churchill's volcanic energy became too much, when tempers frayed, it was Attlee's quiet presence that steadied the table. The two men clashed. Churchill liked to dominate meetings, to talk for hours, to chase ideas in every direction. Attlee, listening patiently, would sometimes cut in with a line that became legendary among civil servants. "Prime Minister, I think, we are drifting a little from the point." He could also be devastatingly sharp in private. When Churchill once quipped, "You are a modest man, Mr. Attlee, with much to be modest about." Attlee's reply came later, when Churchill was out of the room and someone began to gossip about him. Attlee shut it down. "Mr. Churchill is a great man. He is also a sick man. One of the things I most admire about him is that he does not let his infirmities affect his judgment in public affairs." This was rivalry without theatrics, steel wrapped in courtesy. As the war ground on, the domestic pressure mounted. Bombs fell on London, Coventry, Liverpool. Cities burned. Families slept in tube stations. But people were already asking a dangerous question. When this is over, what then? Do we just go back to the old Britain of slums and unemployment? In 1942, a civil servant named William Beveridge published a report. It proposed a sweeping system of social insurance from cradle to grave to slay what he called the 5 giants: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. The public devoured it. Newspapers sold out. Copies were read aloud in air raid shelters. For millions, it was a promise that the sacrifices of war would be repaid with security and peace. Churchill was wary. He spoke of not being committed to every dot and comma. He wanted flexibility, caution, time. Attlee saw something else: a program, a roadmap, a way to harness the hopes of a people who had given everything. Inside the coalition, the clock started ticking again. This time, not towards military catastrophe, but towards a political reckoning. The war in Europe had to be won, but the moment peace came, an election would follow. Labour and the Conservatives, who had marched together against Hitler, would turn their guns on each other. Attlee and his team, men like Ernest Bevin, the ex-dock worker turned giant of wartime administration, began to think beyond victory: housing, health, full employment, nationalization of key industries. They sketched in private what they could not yet declare in public. A plan not just to patch up the old Britain, but to replace it. In May 1945, with Hitler dead and Germany defeated, the coalition began to crack. Churchill wanted it to continue until Japan was beaten. Labour refused. The war in Europe was over, they argued. The voters must now choose. Attlee went to see Churchill in Downing Street. 2 men who had steered Britain through its gravest peril now sat facing each other across a table littered with dispatch boxes. Churchill was incredulous. An election now, in the middle of a war in the Far East? Madness. Ingratitude. Treachery. Attlee didn't raise his voice. The understanding they had reached back in 1940, he reminded Churchill, was simple. When the European war was won, the coalition would end. Promises had to be kept. The date was set. Britain would go to the polls in July 1945. The campaign would last just weeks. Soldiers still fighting in Burma and the Pacific would cast their votes by post. At home, bombed cities would hang up bunting not for victory but for hustings. Churchill, the war leader, now unleashed his full oratorical power against his own deputy. He warned that a Labour government would need some form of Gestapo to enforce its plans. He painted Attlee's team as dangerous ideologues ready to smother British freedom under bureaucracy. Attlee's response was almost shockingly calm. He spoke not of fear, but of hospitals, schools, jobs, homes. Where Churchill thundered about the past, Attlee talked about the morning after the sirens stopped. The contrast could not have been starker. The lion of yesterday facing the clerk of tomorrow. As polling day approached, no one quite believed Labour could win outright. Churchill's shadow was too large, his voice too familiar. The newspapers, overwhelmingly conservative, repeated the same assumption. The British people might want change, but they would not discard their savior. On 26 July 1945, the results began to come in. Town after town that had once reliably voted conservative, middle-class suburbs, industrial boroughs, seaside resorts, fell to Labour. Great industrial cities turned solid red. Seats where Attlee had once struggled to get a hearing now returned Labour MPs with thumping majorities. In Limehouse, his own constituency, the man the elite had once dismissed as a colorless little organizer increased his majority dramatically. By evening, the map of Britain had been transformed. Labour had not just won, it had swept. Winston Churchill, the man of 1940, the savior of Britain, was out of office. Clement Attlee, the shy middle-class boy who had walked away from comfort to live in the East End, the mouse who had helped the lion win the war, was summoned by the king and asked to form a government. As he walked through the black door of number 10 Downing Street, the clock that had ticked through his quiet childhood, the slums of Limehouse, The trenches of Gallipoli, the betrayals of 1931, and the firestorms of the Blitz seemed to stop for a heartbeat. Now came the hardest question of all. In a country exhausted, bankrupt, half-ruined by war, with ration books still on the table and bomb sites on every street, what would Clement Attlee actually do with power? On the day Clement Attlee became Prime Minister, Britain was closer to bankruptcy than victory. The bunting was still hanging from bomb-scarred lampposts, children were playing in craters where houses had once stood, and somewhere, beneath the rubble lay the brutal truth. The country that had won the war was broke, exhausted, and still on rations so strict that some families ate less meat than they had under the Blitz, and the man now responsible for fixing all of it was the quiet clerk who had just thrown out the greatest war leader in British history. Inside the Treasury, the numbers were terrifying. Britain owed the United States staggering sums. Its industries were outdated, its exports crippled, its gold reserves draining away day by day. If Attlee's government failed to rebuild fast, if jobs didn't come, if homes didn't appear, if hope didn't materialize, there was a real fear that democracy itself might crack, that extremism, fascist or communist, would fill the void. Time was the enemy. A parliament normally lasted 5 years. Attlee and his team looked at the calendar and knew, in a single term, before the money ran out and before Churchill could regroup and strike back, they had to reinvent Britain from the ground up. He did not rush into number 10 as a conqueror. He walked in small, neat steps, a thin man in a plain suit, carrying a battered briefcase. Civil servants, used to Churchill's booming entrances, looked up and almost missed the moment power changed hands. No cigar smoke, no jokes in the hallway, just a brisk nod, a quiet, "Good morning," and then the sound of a door closing behind him. But that door shut on one world and opened on another. Attlee's cabinet was a roll call of strong personalities. Ernest Bevin at the Foreign Office, the former docker who barged through diplomacy like a battleship. Aneurin Bevan at Health, the fiery Welsh orator who could rouse miners to tears. Stafford Cripps at the Board of Trade, emaciated, austere, almost monk-like in his devotion to sacrifice and planning. In that room of egos, Attlee was the least visibly imposing man present, and the only one who could fire all the others. He chaired the first cabinet meeting with his usual understatement. No speeches, no big vision statement. Just a list. Coal, railways, steel, health, education, housing, full employment. He moved down it briskly, as if organizing a parish fete rather than the most radical program of domestic reform in British history. But behind that calmness was a ruthless decision. They would not tinker. They would not patch the old system. They would use the emergency powers of wartime and the overwhelming labor majority to push through a revolution in under 5 years. The clock was already ticking. Almost immediately, the rivalry with Churchill resumed. Only now the roles had flipped. Across the House of Commons, where they had once sat side by side in a wartime coalition, Churchill now glowered from the opposition benches, leader of the Conservative Party, watching the man he had once called a modest fellow, with much to be modest about, wield the powers he had just lost. Churchill enjoyed mocking the new government's drab appearance. An outfit of second 11 players, he sneered. He was certain they would drown in their own idealism. A bankrupt Britain trying to build a welfare state? They would run out of money, votes, or both, long before the next election. Attlee let him talk. Then, line by line, he began to redraw the country. Within months, key industries that had once been private empires were taken into public ownership. Coal mines whose owners had grown rich while miners choked in dust became nationalized. The railways, chaotic and overlapping, were welded into a single system. Ports, electricity, gas. Bit by bit, the skeleton of the old capitalist order was brought under state control. This was not nationalization as slogans, but as paperwork. Endless meetings, compensation figures, legal drafts. Attlee, who had spent his life in committee rooms, understood the grind. He trusted men like Cripps and Bevan to oversee the details. His job was to keep the cabinet from flying apart under the strain. Meanwhile, outside, London was still pocked with ruins. Whole streets lay flattened, as if some giant hand had brushed them aside. Attlee had promised homes for all, but there was no time and no money for grandiose projects. Prefabs, prefabricated houses, sprang up in parks and on bomb sites, neat little boxes of tin and timber that families moved into with tears of relief. Temporary, officials said. Some would still be standing decades later. The most audacious promise, however, went beyond roofs and railways. It was about the human body itself. The Beveridge Report, adored in air raid shelters, had called for comprehensive social insurance and a national health service. But turning that dream into law meant confronting some of the most powerful interests in Britain. Doctors, especially in private practice, smelled a threat to their livelihoods and independence. The British Medical Association denounced the proposed National Health Service as socialized medicine. Pamphlets warned of bureaucrats between you and your doctor. The language grew vicious. Here, too, Churchill saw a weakness. The Conservatives attacked the plan as reckless, unaffordable, a step toward totalitarian control. At the center of the storm stood Aneurin Bevan, health minister, thundering about Tories lower than vermin, words that caused Attlee no end of headaches. Bevan wanted nothing less than a fully public service, free at the point of use, from the cradle to the grave. Civil servants advised caution. Treasury officials blanched at the cost. Attlee watched the clock. He knew that if they delayed, if they trimmed too much, the chance might never come again. Already the American loan that kept Britain afloat came with conditions and a timetable. Already the pound was under siege in foreign markets. He had at best a few years before crisis forced retreat. So he made a choice that startled even some of his own colleagues. He backed Bevan. Behind closed doors, Attlee met with furious medical leaders. He listened as they predicted disaster. He compromised where he had to, allowing doctors to retain a measure of private practice, offering better pay than initially planned. But he refused to abandon the principle. The NHS would be universal. It would be largely funded from taxation, not insurance stamps. It would be free at the point of delivery. On 5th July 1948, the National Health Service opened its doors. The first day was not a grand televised spectacle. It was a queue. Outside hospitals and clinics, people who had gone years without seeing a doctor lined up with aching teeth, festering wounds, untreated illnesses. One London clinic reportedly saw more dental work in a single week than in the previous year. In some valleys of South Wales, children tasted orange juice and cod liver oil provided by the news service and, for the first time, felt that the state cared whether they lived or died. Churchill fumed. The Conservatives warned of bankruptcy. Treasury alarms howled. But Attlee, that apparently colorless little man, had just helped create one of the most beloved institutions in British life. Against the clock, against the odds. And yet, even as this peaceful revolution unfolded at home, another, more violent reckoning was underway abroad. The British Empire, on which Attlee had once served as a young officer, was cracking. The war had shattered its myth of invincibility. Nationalist movements, long suppressed, surged forward. In India, where tens of thousands had gone to prison for opposing British rule, the demand for independence was now unstoppable. Here, Attlee made another decision that staggered the old imperial establishment. He would not cling on. Churchill, watching from opposition, was horrified. To him, India was the jewel in the crown. To lose it would be to betray history. He raged, he warned, he predicted chaos and slaughter. India, he claimed, was not ready. Attlee saw something different. A vast country that would tear itself, and Britain, apart if denied. Under Attlee's direction, his government moved with what seemed like astonishing speed. A viceroy, Lord Mountbatten, was sent to negotiate the transfer of power. The deadline was breathtaking. Independence by the summer of 1948, later brought forward to August 1947. In less than 2 years, the Raj that had taken centuries to construct would vanish. The clock ticked faster. Religious tensions surged. When the final plan was announced, partition, splitting British India into India and Pakistan, the result was a human catastrophe. Around 10 to 12 million people were uprooted in the largest mass migration in history. Trains arrived at stations full not of passengers but of corpses. Villages burned. The blood of Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs soaked the soil that had once been paraded as proof of British order. Attlee watched this horror from London, signing the last documents that ended British rule. Critics said he had rushed. Others said there had been no good choice. That delay would have meant civil war under the Union Jack instead of the flags of new nations. Either way, a line had been crossed. Britain was no longer the unquestioned imperial master of Asia, and India was not the only frontier of change. In Palestine, in Greece, in Malaya, British forces and administrators wrestled with rebellion, terrorism, civil war. Attlee, the supposed champion of anti-imperialism, found himself authorizing troops, emergency regulations, counterinsurgency campaigns. He was praised in Washington for standing firm against communism in Greece and Malaya, even as he dismantled empire elsewhere. The contradictions piled up like unread briefing papers on his desk. Then came the Cold War. The alliance that had beaten Hitler fractured with astonishing speed. Soviet troops remained in Eastern Europe. Communist parties backed by Moscow pushed for power in Italy, France, Greece. In 1948, Stalin blockaded West Berlin, trying to starve the city into submission. Churchill, from opposition, sounded the alarm in those same ringing tones he had once used against Hitler, denouncing an Iron Curtain across Europe. But the man actually making the choices about how to respond was Attlee. Under his government, Britain became a founding member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a military alliance binding Western Europe and North America together against the Soviet Union. At the same time, in almost total secrecy, Attlee authorized the development of a British atomic bomb. It was a decision that shocked those who saw him as a gentle socialist dreamer. The man who had built the National Health Service now poured precious, desperately needed resources into laboratories and secret test sites. Even some cabinet colleagues were barely informed. But Attlee, who had seen what fascism could do and who now watched Stalin tighten his grip, believed that without nuclear weapons, Britain would become, in his phrase, a second-class nation. So while Bevan battled for hospitals and Cripps for balanced budgets, another darker project ticked away behind locked doors. A race to explode a British bomb before Britain's voice was dismissed entirely. The pressure on the economy, already immense, became almost unbearable. In the winter of 1947, nature turned against Attlee as well. Coal stocks were low, power stations were fragile. Then the cold came. Temperatures plunged, rivers froze, snowdrifts buried roads and rail lines. The government, desperate to save fuel, ordered factories to shut, electricity to be cut off for hours each day. Families huddled in coats indoors as the lights flickered and died. Photographs from that winter show London under a blanket of white. But behind the beauty lay paralysis. Production collapsed. Exports suffered. Attlee's enemies called it the fuel crisis, holding it up as proof that Labour's grand plans were built on sand. In 1949, the pound was devalued. Overnight, Britain's currency lost a third of its value against the dollar. It was a humiliation that cut deep into national pride. Churchill pounced, ridiculing the bankrupt boys in government. He portrayed Attlee as out of his depth, an administrator drowning in world events he could not control. Inside the Labour Party itself, the strain showed. Bevan thought too much was being sacrificed to the gods of austerity and rearmament. The right wing of the party feared that Bevan's rhetoric was scaring off middle-class voters. Attlee sat in the middle, listening more than speaking, letting rival arguments clash across his desk before summing up quietly and making the call. Always the same dilemma haunted him. Guns or butter? Hospitals or bombers? Welfare or war? Each pound could be spent only once. Each decision stole from somewhere else. By 1950, the first 5-year parliament was almost over. The ticking clock that had started in 1945 reached zero. The government had nationalized core industries, built hundreds of thousands of homes, created the NHS, expanded education, and laid the foundations of a welfare state that millions now relied on. But it had also presided over rationing more severe than during the war, a currency humiliation, a freezing winter, an accelerating Cold War, and voters were tired. Churchill was waiting. As leader of the opposition, he had spent 5 years sharpening his case. That Labour's Britain was a grey, joyless place of queues and coupons, run by doctrinaires who meant well but understood nothing of individuality or growth. He promised, set the people free, from controls, from snooping officials, from the long arm of the state. Attlee, knowing he had to renew his mandate before his majority decayed entirely, called a general election in February 1950. The campaign was tight, fierce, and intensely personal. Churchill painted Attlee as a mere chairman of committees, a man pushed around by stronger colleagues, incapable of vision. Attlee replied with his usual flat delivery. But with a record behind him, no previous Labour leader had ever carried into an election. Full employment, new schools, new hospitals, a welfare net that meant illness no longer automatically meant destitution. When the ballots were counted, Labour clung to power, but only just. The party's huge majority had been cut to a sliver of 5 seats. One cabinet resignation, one by-election upset, could topple the government. The time pressure, which had been fierce in 1945, now became brutal. Attlee's second term was more like a countdown than a government. As if to prove that history has a dark sense of timing, the Korean War broke out in June 1950. North Korean forces, backed by the Soviet bloc, swept into the South. The United States, under President Truman, rushed to respond and expected its allies to follow. Britain, still staggering under debt and rationing, now had to send troops and planes to a new war thousands of miles away. Rearmament accelerated. Billions of pounds which socialists had dreamed of pouring into schools and houses were diverted into ships, tanks, and jet engines. Within labor, the split became open. Bevin, furious at the scale of rearmament, and the charges being introduced for some dental and optical services within the NHS, resigned from the cabinet in 1951, denouncing the direction of the government. For the first time, Attlee's authority over his own party seemed to falter. On the other side of the chamber, Churchill could hardly believe his luck. The great rival who had swept him from power was now presiding over resignations, austerity, and war in Asia. He could campaign as the voice of continuity and competence, promising to preserve the good bits of labor's welfare state while restoring freedom and prosperity. Attlee, worn down by years of 16-hour days and constant crises, looked older than his age. Colleagues noticed the stooped shoulders, the deeper lines, the moments of exhaustion. Yet he refused to step aside. He had taken labor into government, overseen its greatest reforms. He would not hand Churchill a second victory by quitting before the fight was over. In October 1951, gambling that he could still win, Attlee went to the country once more. The election was agonizingly close. Labor actually won more votes nationwide than the Conservatives. But under Britain's electoral system, that did not guarantee victory. Seat by seat, constituency by constituency, the map tilted away from Attlee. Marginal districts that had turned red in the euphoria of 1945 now flickered back to blue. As the final results came in, the arithmetic was undeniable. Winston Churchill, the man Attlee had quietly maneuvered into Downing Street in 1940 and then defeated in 1945, had now defeated him. On a gray October day, Clement Attlee walked out of number 10 Downing Street for the last time as Prime Minister. There were no crowds chanting his name, no victorious music, no fireworks, just a few reporters, some photographs, and a waiting official car he chose not to use. In one of those almost unbelievable details that fit him perfectly, he is said to have left office and simply taken a taxi, hat on, coat buttoned against the chill. Behind him, in those modest rooms, he left something invisible but immense. A transformed state, a new idea of what Britain owed its citizens, and a question that would not be fully answered until long after the votes were counted and the banners came down. What would history make of the quiet man who had beaten Churchill once, lost to him once, and changed the country in ways neither his friends nor his enemies fully understood while he was still alive? The man who had rebuilt Britain walked out of Downing Street with no security detail, no victory parade, and not enough money to retire. Within a few years, he would sit on a hard wooden bench in an NHS waiting room, the very system he had created, quietly holding a numbered ticket like everyone else, while newspapers sneered that his time was over and his revolution already fading. But for Clement Attlee, losing office in 1951 was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the most brutal race against time of his life. A struggle, fought in failing health and advancing age, to stop his greatest rival from unpicking everything he had built. Because Churchill was back, and they both knew they would not get many more rounds. Attlee stepped from the taxi into a different London. The trappings of power vanished almost overnight. The briefings, the red boxes, the late-night calls from Washington, the car at the door, gone. He and Violet moved back to their modest house in Stanmore, in the suburbs, where the neighbors hung out washing and kids played. In the street, as if a former prime minister weren't living 2 doors down. There were no lucrative memoirs waiting to make him rich. His autobiography, when he finally wrote it, would be titled with typical understatement, As It Happened, and sell respectably but not sensationally. There were no big company boards queuing up to pay him fortunes. He had spent his career attacking the profiteers of war and industry. He was hardly their first choice for a non-executive director. So in a way that feels almost impossible to imagine now, the man who had overseen an atomic bomb program and the creation of the National Health Service found himself worrying about very ordinary things. School fees, electricity bills, the price of coal for his own small hearth. But he did not have time to dwell on it. Within days of leaving Number 10, he was back in Parliament, now sitting where Churchill had sat for 6 long years, on the opposition benches, facing across the green carpet at his old wartime partner turned rival. The roles had flipped again, but the stakes were the same. Attlee knew exactly what Churchill and the Conservatives wanted to do. They had never believed in nationalization. They had fought the NHS tooth and nail. They thought Labour's commitment to full employment was a fantasy, its planning control freakery. And now, with the country still fragile and global tensions rising, they had the perfect cover to cut, trim, and roll back. The clock, which had always ticked in Attlee's head, now hammered. He was 68 years old. He had pushed his body through war, through 6 grinding years in Downing Street. There would not be another decade in frontline politics. If Churchill tore apart the welfare state within 5 years, Attlee's titanic effort since 1945 would not just be over. They would be written off as a doomed, expensive mistake. So the quiet man sharpened his weapons. In the House of Commons, the debates between Churchill and Attlee in the early 1950s were nothing like the euphoric battles of 1945. They were slower, heavier. 2 aging heavyweights stepping back into the ring, neither as quick as they once were, but still dangerous. Churchill still had the voice, the rolling phrases, the theatrical pauses that filled microphones and captivated reporters. Attlee still had the tone of a council clerk reading minutes. And yet, bit by bit, something unexpected happened. When Churchill's government reviewed the NHS, it did not abolish it. When it looked at social insurance and family allowances, it tweaked and trimmed, but kept the core. The Conservatives, who had howled about socialism from 1945 to 1951, quietly accepted most of the Attlee settlement. This was not because they suddenly agreed with him. It was because the country did. In working men's clubs, in new council estates, in terraced streets where doctors had once been luxuries and illness had meant ruin. People had tasted what it meant to see a doctor without handing over coins, to draw a pension with some sense of security, to live in a house that did not leak or collapse. They were not going back. Churchill saw that. So did his wily new chancellor, Rab Butler. They called it consolidation. Historians would later give it a nickname, Buttskillism, the strange post-war consensus where Tory Butler and Labour's Hugh Gaitskell ended up defending much the same economic and welfare structure. Attlee, watching from across the aisle, understood the deeper truth. His revolution had sunk roots faster than anyone expected. It was now politically lethal to attack it head-on. But if the external enemy seemed to be softening, a new battle opened inside his own party. Labour in opposition was not the unified machine of 1945. The strain of government had cracked it. On the left, Aneurin Bevan and his followers believed Attlee's government had compromised too much, on charges in the NHS, on nuclears, weapons, on standing with America in Korea. On the right, figures like Gaitskell worried that Bevan's firebrand socialism would scare off swing voters and hand the Conservatives permanent power. Attlee, already an old man, had to referee an argument raging between men 20 years younger than him, and he had to do it while facing Churchill across the chamber and trying not to let his own body betray him. In 1953, Churchill suffered a serious stroke that the public were barely told about. A year later, in 1954, Attlee himself had a stroke, suddenly and without warning. One side of his face drooped, speaking became harder. For a man who had always separated himself from his emotions, the betrayal of his own body must have felt like the cruelest joke. He recovered partially, driving himself back into work with stubborn determination. But the signs were there, and he knew it. The hands shaking slightly when he lifted his notes, the fatigue that crept up faster, the knowledge that the eyes of his own MPs were starting to slide past him to the men who would come next. And still, he refused to quit. Not yet. There would be one last reckoning at the ballot box, but this time, it would not be with Churchill. By 1955, Churchill was finally done. He resigned as Prime Minister, bowed out with the honors of a grateful nation, and handed the keys of Number 10 to his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. Handsome, refined, apparently born to be leader, Attlee, almost 72, faced a savage choice. Retire gracefully now, let a younger man, Gaitskell, Bevan, or someone else, take on Eden, or go to the country one last time himself, risking not just defeat but humiliation as a tired, ill, visibly aging opponent to a glittering new Tory generation. For a man often portrayed as modest to the point of invisibility, The decision he made was astonishingly proud. He stayed. One more fight. The 1955 general election arrived like a final exam for an old student who had already written the textbook. Television, still new, favored youth and glamour. Eden smiled. Attlee squinted. Reporters spoke half-kindly of his twilight and long service. When the votes were counted, there was no romantic twist. The Conservatives increased their majority. Labor lost. The country had chosen the handsome war hero over the worn-out architect of peace. This time, Attlee did not hesitate. Within months, he resigned as labor leader. After 20 years at the top and 4 general election campaigns, he had taken a small, suspicious, faction-ridden party and turned it into the natural alternative government of Britain. He had led it to its greatest triumph, and through its most punishing years. Now he quietly stepped aside, and in his place the party chose Gaitskell. Clever, energetic, modern. A man of the future. The long duel with Churchill was over. The rivalry that had defined British politics for a decade and a half ended not with one dramatic knockout, but with both men shuffling. Off the stage, battered, honored, and old. And here came another twist. In stepping down from the Commons, Clement Attlee did something he had never shown the slightest interest in before. He became a lord. In December 1955, he was created Earl Attlee and Viscount Prestwood, entering the House of Lords at the very top of the British aristocratic ladder. For a lifelong socialist who had spent his youth working in East End slums and denouncing privilege, it seemed like a contradiction. So huge it bordered on satire. But Attlee accepted the title not as a costume change but as a new vantage point. From the red benches of the Lords, he could still intervene, still defend his settlement, still shape the arguments of a changing age. If the class system wanted to give him ermine robes, he would wear them and use them. He did not move to a grand estate or vanish into clubland. He and Violet stayed in their unshowy Stanmore home. Neighbors saw him carry his own shopping. There is a much-told story of a London taxi driver who, on recognizing him, boasted, "You know, I once had that Churchill in my cab." Attlee, unruffled, is said to have replied, "Funny you should say that. I once had him in mine." In the Lords, he was no more theatrical than he had been in the Commons. But when he chose to speak, people listened. The most dramatic moment came in 1956, during the Suez Crisis, when Eden, his old rival in foreign policy, launched a secret, disastrous operation with France and Israel to attack Egypt and seize back the Suez Canal. The invasion was meant to look like old-fashioned imperial strength. Instead, it exposed deep weakness. Under pressure from the United States and from world opinion, Britain was forced into a humiliating retreat. Attlee watched, furious. From the red benches, the old man who had presided over Indian independence and accepted the end of empire rose to condemn Eden's adventure as reckless and wrong. He did not shout. He never did. But there was steel in the quiet sentences. This, he insisted, was not how a modern Britain behaved. For the second time in his life, he was on the opposite side of Churchill's party in a great imperial crisis. But now, unlike in India, the country agreed with him quickly. Eden's reputation collapsed. The Suez debacle became a symbolic gravestone for the old imperial idea. Attlee, frail but still sharp, had lived long enough to see the past he had left behind try to claw its way back, and fail. The years after Suez brought a strange kind of vindication. Conservative governments under Macmillan and then Douglas Home talked the language of efficiency and growth, but they did not dismantle Attlee's core reforms. When Labour returned to power under Harold Wilson in 1964, it did so not as a revolutionary force trying to build a new world from rubble, but as a party arguing about how to update and improve the structures Attlee had built. At home, Attlee's life narrowed. He doted on his children and grandchildren. He read history endlessly. He wrote slowly that dry, careful autobiography that said so little about how he felt, and so much about what had happened. There was tragedy, the death of one of his daughters, the illnesses of friends, the slow failing of Violet's health, but there were also ordinary pleasures. A glass of beer in a quiet pub, a walk in the garden, a good detective story. He used the NHS he had founded, queuing with others, never trying to use his name to get ahead in the line. His rivalry with Churchill, in these later years, thawed into something like mutual respect. When Churchill was given the Order of the Garter, Attlee, himself made a Knight of the Garter in 1956, joined the pantheon of the kingdom's most honored. The two men, who had once argued over the fate of continents, now saw each other at state occasions. Both old, both decorated, both carrying histories too heavy for their shrinking shoulders. In 1965, when Winston Churchill died, the nation stopped. The greatest state funeral since that of Nelson or Wellington was arranged. World leaders flew in. Crowds lined the Thames to watch the coffin pass on a gun carriage, draped in the Union Jack. Among the pallbearers, walking slowly behind the coffin in St. Paul's Cathedral, was Clement Attlee. Cameras captured him. Small, almost frail, face set and expression unreadable. The man who had beaten Churchill in 1945 and been beaten by him in 1951 now helped carry his rival to his grave. Later, when asked for his verdict, Attlee did not mention the jibes, the slights, the years of taunting. He simply said that Churchill was the greatest Englishman of our time. For a long moment, it seemed that history agreed. Statues rose to Churchill, squares and colleges and submarines took his name. His speeches were quoted in schools, his profile etched on posters and mugs. Attlee, by contrast, faded from public memory with eerie speed. He had no cigar, no bulldog scowl, no tear-jerking rhetoric. There was nothing for a poster artist to grab onto. To many in the 1960s, the welfare state and nationalization were just facts of life, part of the wallpaper. The name of the man who had built them slipped quietly from conversation. On 8 October 1967, Clement Attlee died in Westminster Hospital, the city he had served booming and roaring outside his window in the age of the Beatles and the miniskirt, a world away from the horse-drawn carts and gas lamps of his childhood. He was 84 years old. His funeral was nothing like Churchill's. No crowds packed the streets, no banks of cameras relayed the coffin to the world. His body was cremated. His ashes were interred in Westminster Abbey, near the grave of the unknown warrior, an anonymous soldier whose sacrifice he had always felt bound to honor in policy, not just in words. For years after his death, it seemed possible that this would be his fate. A footnote in the shadow of Churchill, a gray figure in the background of black and white newsreels, a name that meant little outside specialist books. And then, slowly, another twist. As the late 20th century wore on, as governments of left and right privatized, deregulated, chiseled away at some parts of the post-war settlement while defending others, historians and political scientists began to look back and ask a harder question. Not who had given the best speeches, but who had changed the country most profoundly. They looked at the map of Britain before 1945 and after 1951, at mortality rates, at slum clearances, at education levels, at the fact that no British child, after Attlee, need fear the workhouse, at the NHS, still battered but beloved, still the institution that most Britons said made them proud of their country. Study after study ranked Clement Attlee, the little man Churchill had mocked, as one of the 2 or 3 greatest prime ministers of the 20th century. Some surveys placed him above every other peacetime leader. His government, once attacked as reckless, came to be seen as the architect of modern Britain. The rivalry with Churchill did not disappear. How could it? One had saved the nation in war, the other had rebuilt it in peace. One's words still sent shivers down spines. The other's sentences still put schoolchildren to sleep. But the crude contrast between great Churchill and Grey Attlee blurred. They became, in the end, 2 halves of the same story. The war leader who refused to surrender, and the quiet socialist who refused to waste the peace. Today, when someone in Britain walks into a hospital and is never asked for a credit card, when an old person lives on a pension rather than charity, when a child from a poor family studies at university, they are walking through the long shadow of Clement Attlee. No statues of him tower over Trafalgar Square. No vast murals shout his name. His legacy hides in policy papers, in institutions, in habits, in expectations. It hides above all in a simple, radical idea he forced through against money, against tradition, against his greatest rival, and against time itself, that a state exists not just to rule its people, but to look after them. For a lifetime, Clement Attlee let others take the applause, the jokes, the spotlight. He sat at the end of the table, chaired the meeting, summed up in a sentence. But when the clock was running down and history was watching, it was the quiet man who drove.